Malik Carter knew that trouble wasn't a person, not exactly, but a pattern of moments, the kind you could step around if you kept your head down and your eyes open. He kept his head up anyway. You didn't survive the city's winters by looking away. Please, if you find this story interesting, please do well to share, comment, and subscribe. Malik was 34, with the steady watchfulness of someone who had learned to read people the way other men read weather reports. He wore his hair in a close fade, the way a lot of men in Northbridge did, and his smile, rare but earned, was the kind that didn't disappear halfway through a conversation. He worked as an EMT for Northbridge Community Health, a job that paid enough to keep him in a small apartment with a view of the river and enough quiet to hear his own thoughts. He wasn't famous, not even in his own circle, just a man who believed in showing up when someone needed him, and who believed that the city's prayers sounded better when they were whispered by someone who had just saved a life. That evening, Malik had been off shift for a few hours and was driving a beat-up Nissan through the near-downtown district, on his way to visit his sister, Layla, who lived in a second-floor walk-up above a bakery that always smelled like cinnamon and something lemony that no one could name. The streets were slick with melting snow, a phenomenon that had Northbridge's residents grumbling but grateful. The slickness made the city feel intimate, as if you could slip into a crack between the sidewalks and disappear from the noise for a moment. He didn't see it at first. The first signal that trouble might be close at hand came in the form of a crowd, a cluster of bodies drawn toward something that had happened in the middle of a cross-street intersection where a storefront sign hummed with neon. It wasn't a riot exactly, but there was a density of people, a chorus of raised voices, and a sudden impossible-to-miss crack of a gunshot that split the night like a broken pane. Malik braked, tires screeching short, hot note against the pavement. He cut the engine, killed the headlights, and listened. The city holds its breath in moments like this, and Malik knew to listen first. He heard a woman screaming, a man's voice cursing, another voice urgent with alarm. Somebody shouted for medics, for help. He didn't waste another heartbeat. He threw the car into park, unclipped his seatbelt, and was out the door before the engine hissed and the streetlight below flickered. What he saw next wasn't anything cinematic or neat. It was raw, real, and a little cruel in its randomness. A man taller than Malik, stockier, the kind of man whose presence seemed to fill the space around him, stood with a wounded, shaking stance in the middle of the crosswalk. A couple of teenagers, one with a hoodie pulled tight over his jaw, the other with a baseball cap that had seen better days, were backing away. The air smelled sharp with gunpowder and fear. People kept their distance, not out of kindness, but out of habit. The same habit that said bigger problems could be avoided if you kept your phone in your pocket and your feet moving. The man Malik rushed to wasn't a stranger. He'd seen him around the neighborhood, at the corner store where Malik sometimes picked up a soda, or at the basketball courts where Malik's younger cousin sometimes played. His name was Darry Miles, a black man a few years younger than Malik, with the kind of smile that made his eyes crinkle, the way a man's eyes do when he's about to laugh. Darry was a small-time mechanic who had helped Malik fix a leaky radiator on a hot summer afternoon last year, the sort of neighbor who didn't ask questions and didn't need to be asked. Darry lay sprawled on the pavement, one leg twisted awkwardly beneath him, a smear of red across his left temple where the street had found him first. A short, brutal struggle had left him battered, but still conscious enough to reach out with a hand that trembled as he tried to grab the hope that Malik was there to give him. Malik dropped to his knees, his EMT training kicking in with the cold, clinical calm that came from years of practice, and a mind that could switch from human to medical in the space of a heartbeat. Hey, stay with me," Malik said, gripping Darry's shoulder to steady him. He checked Darry's breathing, counted the seconds between breaths, listened for a zap of a heartbeat beneath the shirt. The crowd pressed in, not daring to intrude, but not quite able to break away either. A couple of the bystanders held phones up like it would rain down luck from the sky if enough screens lit up at once. "Ambulance on the way," someone shouted, as if the city itself could be summoned with a loud enough voice. Malik spoke to Darry in a low, even voice, steady, reassuring. "We're here, man. You're going to be okay. I'm here." Darry tried to meet Malik's gaze, his lips curling into a grim smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He whispered something, a name, Perhaps a prayer or a plea. Malik wasn't sure. Then his breath hitched, a shallow, gaunt exhale that sounded almost like relief, and his eyes closed for a heartbeat before fluttering open again, unfocused, searching Malik's face, as if a map could be found there that would guide him back to life. The struggle, if it could be called a struggle, had lasted mere seconds, but it had felt like an entire memory compressed into a moment. The shooters or attackers had vanished as quickly as they'd appeared, leaving behind the echo of their footsteps, the smell of fear, and Darry's body slick with the winter night air and the sheen of blood that made Malik's fingers slick with it as he pressed against the wound, applying pressure where the wound was most severe. He could sense the crowd tightening, the way people draw back when someone bleeds, the same way a crowd would back away from a stall of aggressive dogs at the county fair. The ambulance arrived in a gleam of white and red, lights spinning, siren wailing in a desperate, almost mournful song. Paramedics swarmed, taking control with practiced efficiency, loading Darry onto the gurney, asking Malik questions with a calm seriousness that suggested the safety and certainty of a hospital bed would be earned soon enough. Malik told them what he had seen, the path of Darry's fall, the moment the gun went off, the crowd's scatter pattern, the direction of the attacker's escape. Was he armed? One paramedic asked, glancing toward the alley behind the crosswalk where the shadowy outlines of dumpsters and fire escapes stood like silent witnesses. No, Malik replied, repeating what he had seen, what his eyes insisted had happened. He wasn't the aggressor. He was the one who needed help. Darry's eyes found Malik's again as he was wheeled away, a look that could have passed for gratitude if not for the bruised, stubborn panic that flickered across his face in that last second of consciousness. He looked as if he wanted to say something more, but the doors closed, and the world beyond the sliding glass panel grew quiet, the siren's wail fading into the memory of the crowded street. Malik stood, wiping his hands on a soggy sleeve, feeling the sting of the cold bite his skin. He looked around at the faces in the crowd, a mother with a stroller, a man in a greasy cap clutching a phone like a lifeline, a college kid in a hoodie who looked as though he wished he could disappear into the curb. No one spoke to him directly. No one dared. They spoke in whispers, in the way neighbors talk when their safety phrase, choosing to remind themselves that they'd seen nothing, or that they'd seen only what they wanted to remember. An officer approached, a man with a badge that looked almost too heavy for his belt. He introduced himself as Detective Lamas, a name that did not quite fit the man's calm, almost exhausted eyes. He had a demeanor that suggested he'd seen more than his fair share of trouble, the kind of calm you only get after years of listening to people lie and tell the truth in almost equal measure. "You're Malik Carter?" the detective asked, eyes sweeping Malik from his shoes to the crown of his head, as if inventorying every possible piece of evidence that could link him to the crime. "I am," Malik said, keeping his voice even, not willing to show even a quarter of the tremor he felt beneath his ribs. He wasn't the type to stall. He believed in telling the truth, even when the truth didn't sound like it would help him in the moment. "Tell me what happened from the start," the detective said, though Malik could tell from the tone that this was not going to be a friendly conversation. Malik recited the events, careful to emphasize the nonviolent nature of his intervention. He described Darry's wounds, the location of the assault, the way the attackers had fled, and the exact moment he'd knelt by Darry's side and tried to give him life with the basic first aid he knew so well from his EMT days. He explained that he'd stayed with Darry until the ambulance arrived, that he hadn't touched or moved Darry in any way that could have worsened his condition, that his sole objective had been keeping Darry breathing until professionals could take over. But the detective wasn't convinced by the clinical account. Northbridge had a way of twisting stories until they looked unfamiliar, until the truth, if there was one, was buried beneath a mound of speculation and fear. There were questions Malik expected to be asked, and some he hadn't anticipated. "Witnesses say you were in the area. A man matching your description was seen near the scene just before the shooting," Detective Lamas said, his voice light, almost casual, as if discussing the weather rather than a homicide. "Can you explain your proximity to the scene? Why were you there at that time?" Malik paused, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had been on his way to his sister's apartment, he reminded himself, a path that should have taken him home and toward a quiet evening with a playlist of old gospel songs and a mug of tea. He'd stopped because someone was in trouble, because Darry had looked up at him with that brief, hopeful expression that might have been a request for help or a plea to be saved from something worse. "I was driving by," Malik said evenly. "I saw someone in trouble. I stopped. I did what I'm trained to do." The detective's eyebrows rose just a fraction, enough to convey doubt, but not enough to betray a personal stance. "And you're sure there wasn't any kind of altercation prior to the rescue?" Malik's mind flickered to the few hours before the incident. He'd spent the early evening at a neighborhood clinic, volunteering to help with a free clinic for families who couldn't afford routine care. He'd spoken to a nurse who had been there, a woman named Rosa, who knew him from other volunteer events. He remembered her telling him that Darry had stopped by the clinic that same day, looking for help with a vehicle issue, a reminder that Darry wasn't a stranger to the people who lived and breathed in that part of town. But the details, the human ones that mattered, felt slippery in the moment. The detective's questions were precise, the sort that were designed to trap an alibi into a confession or a contradiction. Malik answered with the truth as he saw it, and then offered a simple statement that carried more weight than it appeared. "If you want to know who did this, you should look for the person who approached me first, not the person I tried to save." The detective did not smile. That, Malik thought, was the worst news. A cop's inability to recognize a clear act of mercy as something that could be the first spark of a larger, more complicated narrative. The detective asked Malik to stay for a formal interview, to provide fingerprints, to give a statement that could be sealed or released depending on the case's trajectory. As Malik stood waiting, he watched the crowd disperse, the streetlights flicker and dim, the bakery's cinnamon scent sliding out into the night air as a small, stubborn reminder of ordinary life continuing on despite the night's violence. He thought of his sister, Layla, who would be awake at this hour, probably worrying about the distance between Malik's desire to help and the city's willingness to see him as a suspect rather than a savior. Back at the scene, the police processed the area with a methodical, almost ceremonial pace of people who had done this exact routine hundreds of times. Photograph the pavement, collect shell casings, account for every footprint that could be dusted for prints, take statements from those who would later claim they hadn't seen anything, or, if they did, would certainly forget it in the morning. The bystanders, who had filmed parts of the incident with their phones, began to disappear into the night, their footage already fragmenting into 100 different versions of what happened, each one as reliable as the last. By the time Malik was escorted to the squad car, the neighborhood's voices had started to shift. Some whispered that he had saved a life, and a few whispered louder that he might have caused trouble by getting involved in the first place. A couple of people muttered that they'd seen a red smear on Malik's jacket, a detail the observers insisted could point to something dangerous. Malik had not seen red on his own jacket. He had seen red on Darry's temple, and then the color disappeared under the ambulance's bright lights as the medics attended to him. But the rumor was a stubborn thing, and rumor travels faster than truth in a city that loves its headlines more than its mercy. The hours after the incident blurred into each other. Interviews with detectives, a search of Malik's apartment for any contraband, for any weapon that could somehow connect him to the crime. Nothing found, of course, because Malik did not own a weapon. He hadn't needed one since he was a kid, when he learned a few lessons about standing down and letting life go on. He'd spent most of his adult life trying to mediate the kind of violence that happened in Northbridge's darker corners, the kind of violence that took place when fear surged and people forgot to breathe. The charges, when they came, felt sudden to Malik, as if his life had suddenly been rewritten on a page that was flipped by someone else. The police announced, quietly, with a practiced insanity that suggested they were used to delivering bad news, that Malik Carter would be held for the night on suspicion of murder, a charge that seemed to flatten the air in the room and make his lungs feel too small to inhale. The city's news channels picked up the thread faster than a stray spark catches on dry brush. Headlines flashed across screens in cafes and on televisions in living rooms. Hero or threat. The man who saved a life now faces murder charges. The phrase "fellow black man" was repeated in many reports, sometimes with a sigh of relief that the suspect was black, so as to avoid a broader discussion about police biases, sometimes with a cruel kick that hinted at the city's tired, old prejudices about black men and violence. That night, Malik's sister, Layla, stood at the doorway of her apartment, listening to the radio that crackled with the echo of the day's events. She knew her brother's heart, the way he would never let a stranger fall, and would risk his own safety to intervene. She was not surprised that his heroism would be turned into something else by the city's appetite for tragedy and spectacle. The city would demand a villain to balance all the courage that had come before it, and in Northbridge, the villain often wore a badge or the label of a suspect with a record or a rumor that could be magnified into a confession the public would accept. As Malik sat in the interview room, the fluorescent lights hummed above his head in a monotone, almost teasing rhythm. The room's coldness pressed in on him, metal chairs, a glass window that reflected his own anxious face back at him, and a clock that seemed to move in slow motion, each tick a reminder that time was a luxury he didn't have. The detective reading his rights spoke in a measured, almost clinical voice, outlining the consequences of false statements and the potential plea deals that would come later if the evidence didn't align with the narrative the media had already begun to craft. Malik wanted to tell the truth, the entire, unfiltered truth. He wanted to explain who Darry was to him, the way they had spoken only days earlier about cars, about repairs, about a shared sense of responsibility to their community. He wanted to explain that he had no reason to hurt anyone after saving a life, that his sole intention had been to preserve a life, not to end one. But the words didn't arrive with the ease of a friend's hand on his shoulder. They felt heavy, like stones being dropped into a quiet lake, sending ripples through the water's surface that he could not control. The night stretched on, the way nights do when the city refuses to sleep and the people who protect it are too tired to pretend they're not burning out. Malik's alibi, he had been with a sister who could corroborate his location at the time they were questioned, felt fragile in the face of a system that needed a narrative, a culprit, a reason for the crowd's swelling anger and the media's hunger for closure. The more he spoke, the more the interview felt like a test he hadn't studied for, a quiz where every answer could be used to fit a broader, harsher story. By the time dawn peeked over the river, Malik's world had shifted in a way that felt as permanent as the winter ice on the harbor. He was a man who had saved a life, and yet the city's gaze, its collective eye, seemed intent on turning that act into a crime. The charges were pending, the media's attention was a pitiless spotlight, and Malik found himself in the strange, disorienting space where heroism is recognized only by the very few who choose to see it, while the many choose to see only the danger it might invite. In the quiet that followed the morning's chatter, Malik thought of a line he'd once spoken to a patient during a long, slow shift at the clinic. Courage isn't loud. It's consistent. He hoped that somewhere in the reporting, somewhere in the city's breathless rush to judge, that truth would survive the next few days. The truth that a man who had given his last ounce of strength to save another man's life didn't deserve to be defined by the moment he was accused of a crime he did not commit. But for Malik, the night's end arrived not with a verdict, but with a new, heavier question. If he hadn't intervened, would Darry still be alive? And if he hadn't survived the interview room's sterile, accusing glare, would the city ever let a truth that didn't fit its narrative be heard at all? The questions hung in the air like winter frost, chilling him to the core, as the investigation, the defense, and the race to tell Darry's story without becoming a tool of a broader, more dangerous narrative. The morning after dawned with the same stubborn gray light that had watched Northbridge all winter. Malik's sister, Layla, pressed a mug of tea into his hands when he stepped into the small kitchen, the steam fogging the window as if to blur out the city's gaze for just a moment. He kept the mug to his chest and listened to the clock in the living room tick away, counting the seconds the way he counted breaths, when Darry lay on the pavement. 1, 2, 3, until the medics arrived. The city's narrative had already begun to form a shape around him, and Malik wasn't naive enough to pretend it wouldn't. But the clock also reminded him that time had a way of rearranging facts when people grew tired of waiting for the truth to surface. In the days that followed, Malik's defense team assembled with a slow, purposeful speed, the kind of rhythm that came from lawyers who had learned to bend time around a courtroom, never break it. His lead attorney, a civil rights advocate named Noor Ali, brought a calm, razor-sharp energy to the room. Noor didn't promise miracles. What she promised was a radio signal in a storm, consistent, clear, and capable of being heard by jurors who had walked into the courthouse already wearing their own biases like coats. They pored over the police files with Malik's memory as a compass. They questioned every line of the detective's notes, every interval of the timeline, every bystander's whispered testimony. A nurse from the free clinic, Rosa, who had seen Darry the same day Malik had, confirmed that Darry had come in with a vehicle issue but left without incident, smiling and appreciative of the clinic's care. She provided a small but crucial thread, a way to tie together Darry's ordinary life with a plausible reason Malik's presence at the scene could be incidental, not conspiratorial. The defense demanded the video from nearby storefronts and street cameras. The city's cameras, after all, did not always lie. They might blur, blurrier still when straining to tell a story the public wanted to hear, but they could still tell a time-stamped sequence of events. A junior investigator on Noor's team, a woman named Jasmine Okafor, mapped the layout of the scene in meticulous detail, cross-referencing shell casing locations, the trajectory of the gunshot, and the path of Malik's car as it skidded to a stop. Independent experts were brought in to interpret the scene, the kind of specialists who could speak the language of physics, ballistics, and forensics without letting emotion twist the chords of fact. They found something that had been easy to miss in the heat of the moment, a fragment of a shell casing close to the crosswalk's edge that didn't match the gun Malik had helped shield Darry from. Not a confession, but a breadcrumb, a clue that suggested someone else had fired the shots, someone who had fled toward the alley and vanished into the city's maze of fire escapes and back doors. The turning point, though, remained stubbornly human. A bystander who had filmed the aftermath, a college student named Tariq, who admitted he hadn't spoken up because he'd thought Malik's presence would help the wrong people seize the moment. Tariq heard the whispers around him, how a hero could become a suspect in an instant, and his fear kept him quiet. Noor let Tariq tell his story on her terms, on a date when the media's cameras wouldn't distort a single line of truth. Meanwhile, a private donor network, composed of community activists, small business owners, and people who believed in the old city's promise that justice wasn't a rumor, but a public contract, announced a reward. It wasn't a token gesture, but a serious pool of money designated to encourage credible information that could bring the real shooter to light and help clear Malik's name. The reward wasn't for Malik's exoneration alone. It was a poor man's reparation, a statement that the city owed him more than apologies. It owed him visibility in a system that too often erases black heroism when it becomes inconvenient. The media, too, started to shift its tone, albeit slowly. A local investigative reporter, Ari Vega, who had followed Malik's case with both skepticism and genuine concern for the truth, began to map a new, more complete arc of the night. Ari's questions unsettled some of the city's most comfortable narratives. If Malik hadn't been near the scene by chance, then who had? If the shooter had targeted Darry and Malik had merely intervened, what did that say about the dynamics of power in Northbridge? In the middle of this patient acceleration, a second, stranger threat emerged. The crosswalk's lighting had malfunctioned moments before the shooting, a detail the city's public works department initially dismissed as a trivial inconvenience. Noor insisted it mattered. A flicker of light could change the timing of events in a way that reshaped who had been where and when, an essential detail for jurors who would soon decide whether Malik's act of mercy was a crime in disguise or simply mercy. The breakthrough came not with a single bombshell, but with a convergence of small validations that stitched together a different story. The kind of story that required courage to tell because it contradicted the city's need for simple villains and simple heroes. On a rainy afternoon, a CCTV clip from a nearby corner store surfaced, the footage time-stamped to within seconds of the initial gunshot. In the clip, a man in a red hoodie, the hood pulled tight around his face, moves toward the alley behind the crosswalk. He doesn't fire at Darry or Malik. Instead, he darts away, dropping an object that slides under a vehicle and disappears. The object, later recovered, was a discarded cigarette lighter engraved with a sports team emblem Malik recognized, the same emblem found on a discarded jacket earlier in Darry's vicinity. Not long after, forensics re-examined the shell casing from the scene. The casing near the crosswalk didn't belong to the gun Malik had defended the area with. It belonged to a different model, one known to be in possession of an individual who had fled the city days before after a separate incident, a person with a history of violence in the same neighborhood Malik had tried to shield. The forensic expert's report didn't prove Malik's innocence by itself, but it started to tilt the balance. The kind of tilt jurors could feel in their bones, a subtle shift that could no longer be dismissed as a mere error or coincidence. The reward fund paid off in small, tangible ways. A tip from a former co-worker of the shooter who had kept quiet out of fear, a neighbor who recognized the red hoodie from a previous incident and came forward with a partial description that, when cross-checked against the surveillance, narrowed the field. The city's Civilian Oversight Board announced it would review the case with a panel of independent investigators, a gesture that felt both earnest and necessary in a city that had spent years arguing about bias in policing. Darry, who had survived the night after Malik's quick action, emerged as a central figure in the coming months, not as a scapegoat any longer, but as a survivor who carried physical reminders of the night in the form of a limp and a constant ache in his shoulder that made the simplest tasks feel like long journeys. He spoke to Noor's team with a candor that surprised Malik's supporters and unsettled a few voters who preferred the narrative of the miraculous hero to be a solitary black man who saved another black man and then vanished into the night. As Malik's case moved toward court, the evidence grew clearer that Malik hadn't killed anyone. The timeline, the forensics, and Tariq's testimony about the initial crowd's dispersal all pointed toward a different perpetrator. And that perpetrator was, in turn, tied to a string of prior offenses that included threats and a dangerous history with weapons. The defense argued not only for Malik's innocence, but for a broader reckoning, that a city's fear had warped its perception of a black man's truth into a legal trap. Justice, when it finally began to arrive, did so in stages. The first stage was procedural. The charges against Malik were dropped, and the city's prosecutor opened a formal review of the case to determine whether any misconduct had occurred and whether any officers should face discipline for rushing to judgment. Malik's name, once a banner for the city's sensational headlines, began to regain its dignity in the quiet moments between interviews, hospital visits, and long nights on the sofa in his sister's apartment, where the wind slapped against the windows like a chorus demanding applause for truth. The second stage was cosmetic mercy. The reward fund paid out not to Malik, but to a civic justice trust formed from the donor network, a trust designed to fund community-initiated safety programs, victim support services, and independent investigations into complaints against the police, especially those involving people who look like Malik. The trust offered Malik a modest stipend, not a prize for a single act, but a measure of financial stability as he navigated the next chapter of his life. He declined the idea of getting paid for being a hero, but he accepted the aid as a practical means to continue helping others, to keep his EMT badge a symbol of service rather than a burden of suspicion. The final stage, perhaps the hardest, was social forgiveness and institutional reform. The independent panel released its findings, a mix of good intentions and human error, with explicit recommendations for the Northbridge Police Department: improve training on bias, prioritize rapid, transparent sharing of evidence with defense teams, and implement real-time video review for strike points in investigations to prevent the rush to judgment that had so often harmed black communities. A civic reinvestment program, funded partially by the reward's legacy, began to pour money into community clinics, youth mentorship, and neighborhood violence prevention initiatives, all designed to break the old pattern of heroism being treated as suspect by the very people it saves. In the weeks after Malik's exoneration and the case's reevaluation, Northbridge took on a new look. The river's edge reflected a city that had learned something painful but necessary. Courage isn't merely a single act. It's a sustained practice of mercy that must be protected by truth, adorned with accountability, and fed by the public's willingness to insist on both. Malik returned to the job he never stopped doing, EMT work that now carried the weight of something more public, a belief that mercy should come with protection, and that protection is earned through transparency. He treated Darry's injuries as a shared wound, visiting him at a rehabilitation center, listening as Darry spoke in careful, determined phrases about the night and the days that followed. Darry's own healing was not just physical. It was a reckoning with how his life had intersected with the city's fear and Malik's courage. Layla, who had worried about Malik's safety more than she could admit, found a quieter confidence in him again. The sister who had watched the city's gossip swirl around her brother stood with him as they spoke to school groups, church gatherings, and town hall meetings about what it means to protect a neighbor and how a community should respond when the streets demand you choose between fear and mercy. Ari Vega's reporting became a family keepsake in Northbridge, a record of how truth unfurled under pressure, how a city's media cadre could bend toward accountability when given space and time. Noor Ali's firm grew stronger in the wake of the case, expanding its reach to defend others who found themselves trapped in similar narratives, sometimes mistaken, always urgent. And the reward? The town's collective treasury carried forward a quiet giant of memory and transformation. The private donors fund morphed into the Courage and Truth Fund, a standing city endowment dedicated to funding independent investigations, supporting families in crisis, and financing long-term community safety programs. The fund didn't erase the pain of Malik's experience, but it did ensure that the city would not forget how quickly fear can twist a truth into a crime, and how slowly truth, when supported by evidence and courage, can restore a person's name. On a late spring evening, Malik stood at the river's edge with Darry, both men looking across the water as the sun dipped behind the steel silhouettes of Northbridge's bridges. A soft wind carried the scent of smoke from a distant barbecue and something else, the faint tang of rain that would come, as it always did, to wash away the day's dust. Malik spoke first, voice low but steady. "I saved a life that night." The city wanted to rewrite that into a crime because it needed a villain to temper its fear. Darry nodded, the movement small but real. "And you saved my life twice," he said, with a wry humor that didn't quite hide the gratitude in his eyes. "Once with your hands, and once with your truth." "No," Malik said, shaking his head just a fraction. "We saved each other that night, me, Darry, and the city that refuses to turn away when mercy walks through its doors. The reward isn't mine to claim. It belongs to everyone who believed, whether they voiced it or not, that justice is worth fighting for, that a hero's rescue is never a crime, and that the truth, if we're brave enough to face it, is a citywide obligation." In that moment, the river's surface lost its glassy stillness and rippled with a soft, forgiving glow. Northbridge's winter had gone, but a new season, one of accountability, healing, and shared responsibility, had begun. The city exhaled a breath it hadn't known it needed, and Malik felt for the first time in many months that the air might be clear enough to walk through without looking over his shoulder. The final words lingered, not as a verdict, not as a headline, but as a living memory, a true crime story that refused to end with a single act of bravado. It ended with a community that chose to be better, a city that chose to listen, and a man who chose to keep showing up not because he needed the world to thank him, but because someone had once saved his life, and in that saving, somehow, they all found a path to the truth. And if justice ever wore a price, it wore the form of a citizen's oath, to keep watch, to tell the truth, and to ensure that mercy remains a true option for those who need it most. The reward had been paid, not as a prize for a singular act, but as a debt repaid to a city that learned its most enduring lesson. Heroism is not a moment. It is a practice of every day. To everyone who stayed with this story from beginning to end, thank you. Thank you for listening with patience, for giving your attention to a story that asks for reflection rather than rush. In true crime, listening is not passive. It is an act of care. When you choose to hear a story fully, you choose to honor the people inside it and the truth they were almost denied. Stories like this can be heavy. They ask us to sit with discomfort, to question systems we are told to trust, and to recognize how easily compassion can be mistaken for guilt. If this story moved you, that means you were present. That matters. Let this be a reminder that truth often survives because ordinary people refuse to look away. Your attention, your questions, and your willingness to listen are part of what keeps justice possible. Thank you for being here. Keep listening, keep asking, and never underestimate the quiet power of paying attention.